Good morning. I'll be starting in Ezekiel Chapter 22, where we had our scripture reading, Ezekiel Chapter 22. It's good to be here. It's good to be with you this morning. In 480 BC, the Persians had conquered most of the known world at that time. And in fact, nothing had stopped the Persian army from conquering whatever land they desired. And the Persian king has set his sights on Greece and was coming with vast numbers untold. Nothing like it the history had seen before it. The Greeks heard of this, and they sent a small group of soldiers to hold the gap. There was a small land strip between the cliffs and the ocean in which a very small number could hold this vast army. The 300 Spartans are known for their dedication and their sacrifice in this, but there's many Greeks who answered the call and stood in the gap to give their other Greeks the chance to form up and to defeat the Persians. And they were victorious. In Ezekiel chapter 22, Ezekiel is writing about 100 years before the events happened, about 590 BC, just a few years before Jerusalem is destroyed. And what God is doing through Ezekiel is he's telling the people why judgment is going to come upon them. And the group of people that God specifically identifies as the reason for Israel's decay is the leaders. And we see this in Ezekiel chapter 22. I mean, you just see what we went through during the scripture reading. In chapter 25, it talks about how the prophets were evil and destroyed all the true prophets and killed them so that they could be the only ones heard. In verse 26, it talks about the priest who made no distinction between what was common and what was holy. You could just bring whatever you want, and that would be perfectly fine. They would preach whatever tickled the people's ears. In verse 27, it talks about how the princes were greedy and killed the innocent for their own personal gain. In verse 28, it talked about how the prophets would cover for the princes. The princes would pay them off. He said, here, I will give you this certain amount of money if you tell the people this. And so that through the prophets and the princes colluding together, they could keep the people in line. And as a result from this, the people in verse 29 were wicked. They were greedy, murderous, and liars, just like their leaders. And we come to verse 30. And God is saying, I wish that someone would stand up, someone who would fill the gap, someone that could be a point of virtue and excellence and righteousness and stand in the gap and rebuild walls of righteousness. But he says he can't find anyone. No one. Walls are meant to keep the enemy out of the city and the people inside safe. And whenever there's a gap in the wall, when the wall kind of collapses in one area, it is up to the defenders, the leaders of the city, to rush in and fill that gap and stand firm. Otherwise, the city would be taken over. But when God called on the leaders of his people to rise up and stand in the gap, the spiritual gap of Israel, there was no one to answer the call. At least during the days of Judges, how horrible they would be. And we recently went through the book of Judges of how terrible the people were. At least in those days, he could call on the judges of like Gideon and Deborah and Ehud and Othniel. And these judges, whether they be not perfect whatsoever, they would rise up and stand in the gap. Or even during the days of Ahab and Jezebel, some of the darkest of Israel, there was still Elijah and 7,000 other prophets who had not bowed the knee to Baal. But it comes to a point in Israel where God says he can't find anyone. Not a Deborah, not a Samuel, not Elijah, not Elisha, not a David. No one. No one to stand in the gap. The only leaders that remain that we read of are the homesick heroes like Ezekiel and Daniel and his three friends. In Jerusalem, the leadership had slowly rotted away, so the spiritual walls of Israel had fallen. And we see why Jerusalem has judgment coming. John Maxwell has said what God has said for many years, that everything rises and falls on leadership. And I think that is absolutely true. And you can see that through Israel's history. During the time of the judges, when they had a good leader, a spiritual leader, the people will do basically what was right. But as soon as that leader falls, then they would go about and do whatever was good in their own eyes. Or during the kings, when there was a good king like David or Hezekiah, or Josiah, and they did what was acceptable and right in God's eyes, the people would follow him. But as soon as they died, the people returned and did whatever was evil to God's eyes. And that statement that everything rises and falls on leadership is no less true today. The church needs godly leaders. God needs people that will stand in the gap that our societies are causing at an alarming rate and will say, I will stand in the gap for God. We have to have those people. We have to have those leaders. Because if we don't, we won't look much more different than Jerusalem in 590 BC. So with the remainder of my time this morning, I want to look at two questions. What is a true godly leader? What do true godly leaders look like? And two, how do we grow godly leaders today? Because they are certainly important in all times and societies, no matter who you are. So first, what does a godly leader look like? A godly leader is one that has direction. They are people that know who they are, they know where they're going, they know how to get there, and they influence others to go there. A leader is not a follower. They are not someone that just follows what everyone else is doing at that time. They know where they are, they know where they're going, and influence others to come with them. And really, what Christian should not fit that definition of a leader in some form or fashion? We should be influencers with those around us. And we should be so influential and know where we're going and know who we are that people can't help but follow us as we follow Christ. People who lack identity and direction will not have influence on people around them. So when times come up in your work, in your school, wherever you may be, the shopping centers, the coffee places that you go, even in your home and your family, when the time comes where you can influence others and you know where you're going and you know who you are, do you stand up? Do you try to stand in the gap for God? But you can't do that unless you're also a person of good character, because a godly leader is a person of good character. Every single time the Bible talks about appointing people to a place of leadership, a position of leadership, they talk about their character. In Acts chapter 6, verse 3, when talking about appointing deacons, they were men of good repute, full of the Spirit and wise. In Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3, there's a list of characteristics that elders and deacons should be to be able to appoint them to a place of leadership. Even the Old Testament, when Moses and the people of Israel were appointing elders and leaders to help take some of the load off of Moses, they say, look for able men from all the people who fear God and who are trustworthy, who hate bribes, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens. These are the people that you should be. And they're totally opposite of the leaders that we see in Ezekiel 22. The priests and the prophets did not fear God. The princes were greedy and took advantage of the innocent. And they were all not trustworthy of any character. But the most important characteristic a leader must have is that of a servant. It's the trait of a servant. You can look at Matthew chapter 20, verse 25 through 28. We won't read that right now. But I think you're pretty familiar with the story. The disciples were going about how who is the greatest and who is the best out of all of them, who's going to sit on the right hand, who's going to sit on the left, and the common discussions that they would have. And what does Jesus say? Greatest is the servant. You should not rule it like the Gentiles do. Try rule over each other. The greatest of you should be a servant. A true godly leader should not desire a position so they can tell others what to do. Instead, a godly leader desires to serve others the best that they can. Jesus, who is the ultimate example of this, he was the greatest authority that has ever walked this earth, and yet he was also the greatest servant. His whole life, from the time he started his ministry until the time he died, was about serving people. All the time, whether he was tired or he's hungry or he was just done with people in general, he was about serving others. And maybe the ultimate example was washing his disciples' feet, even the feet of the person who would betray him. John Scott has a really good quote on this. He said, the authority by which a Christian leader leads is not by power, but love. Not force, but example. Not coercion, but reasoned persuasion. Leaders have a power, but a power is safe only in the hands of those who humble themselves to serve. And that's absolutely true. A leader who does not have service as one of the foremost things in their mind is a dangerous leader, because they're going to be looking out for themselves and how to take advantage of their position for themselves. A leader must be a servant, a person of good character with a willingness to serve. God says at this point in Israel that he could not find anyone. He could not find someone in the gap, a true leader who would stand in the breach against the enemy, not with spear and sword, but with good character and servant's heart. He couldn't find anyone like that. And so the whole Jerusalem suffered. So that's what a leader looks like. It's a person with good character who knows who they are and where they're going and not afraid to influence others to go the same direction. How do we get those people? How do we get true leaders? How do we grow true leaders today? And I would like to look at Titus chapter 1. Titus chapter 1. This is the passage on eldership. And Paul is giving some good characteristics to look at for elders. Titus chapter 1. Titus chapter 1, and we'll be starting in verse 7. Titus chapter 1, starting in verse 7. For an overseer as God's steward must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or drunken or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-control, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also able to rebuke those who contradict it. Paul gives to Titus and to Timothy also this kind of guideline for the type of people that you should look for as your leaders of your church, these elders. And as you look through that list, what in there should not be true of any mature Christian? What in that list should not be true of any good Christian? When we talk about growing leaders in our church, and especially elders, we're not talking about growing extraordinary, gifted people of leadership with tons of leadership experience and education. We are talking about growing mature Christians. And really, that process starts at home. Training sons, train your daughters to be people of moral integrity and righteousness. People know who they are and where they're going and not afraid of influencing those around them. That starts early. That starts in the home by seeing what dad and mom do and how they should work through different aspects that come up in their life. This starts early on. And then that process continues by everyone in the church. It is continued with everyone. If you look at Ephesians chapter 4, Ephesians chapter 4, we kind of see this a little bit. Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 11, it talks about the different things, gifts that God has given to the church. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11. And he gave the apostles and prophets and evangelists and shepherds and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ, until we attain the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to the mature manhood, to the measure of the stature and fullness of God. And he goes on to talk about how we should not be children, how we are to grow up and not be tossed, and we should know our doctrine so well that we're not tossed to and fro by every doctrine that comes against us. He says that these leaders, these teachers, evangelists, and prophets and apostles are there to grow mature Christians. They are to grow people who are strong in faith, that know Christ and his word, to be loving and serving each other. In other words, they are to be mature Christians. And what happens when you grow mature Christians? That they become teachers, they become elders, become preachers, they become the leaders of the next generation, and the cycle continues when they help the next generation grow up in leadership. Isn't this not what Titus talks, or what Paul talks to in Titus chapter 2? When he talks about older, mature Christians teaching the younger, older men teaching the younger men, and the older, mature Christians teaching the younger Christians. That's what happened to Timothy himself. His parents, or his mom and his grandma, taught him and began that process, and then he went under the mentorship of Paul and became a dynamic young man for Christ. And he had boundless influence. Ideally, those who are mature in the faith, those who are, if we do like 9 and 10 spiritually, would help those who are 7 and 8 spiritually. And those who are 7 and 8 spiritually would help those that are 5 or 6 spiritually, and on down, where we're all helping each other to grow and become like Christ-like in every single way. This is what Jesus and Paul did to those around them constantly. They mentored the next generation of mature Christians and leaders, and they changed the world by doing it. Steve Wolfgang, a preacher that I know quite well, he's over the years taken an unofficial survey of all the churches that he's been to and all the churches he can find, of how many of those churches have elders. And the best estimates that he can come up with are between 66 and 75% of churches do not have elders. Now, leadership is not just a position, as we've talked about. Every one of us should be a leader in some kind of way. However, if we do not have enough male leaders to fill even half of our churches with elders, maybe it's an indication of how we're doing in this area. If there is a lack of leaders in God's body, it's not because we lack leadership experience. It's because we lack devoted Christians. I know churches for a long time that have lasted for 10, 20, 30 years, that have been there for a long time, and they've never had elders. And the question is why? The spiritual walls of our nation are crumbling in many ways. Will there be good, godly, spiritual leaders that will stand in the gap and lead people in the paths of righteousness? Because we have to have those. Because if not, we are not much different than Jerusalem in 590 BC. I want to leave you with two questions. One, are we actively growing leaders now? In Acts chapter 5, when a situation came about in which the Hellenistic women were not being served with the rest of the widows, the apostles didn't say, okay, I need you to start a leadership class. And, after we go through this class and after they give an experience, then we can appoint them to the place in which they can help in this area. No, the need was then. The need was then, right then. There was no time to prepare. Once the gap is broken, there's no time to train the soldiers. You need the soldiers now. And we need to grow leaders now. Are we growing leaders? And that's a job for everyone. Like I said, Timothy was started with his mom and his grandma. That's where it started. And it continued by Paul. It is a job of everyone to grow leaders. When the times come, we need Christians who are ready to stand in the gap and lead the people to God. And it's up to us all to grow them. And the second question is, are you going to be this person? Will you stand in the gap? Because it's not just the responsibility of the elders, of the deacons, of the preacher here to be that person. If you're looking for only those people to stand in the gap, you have a misconception of what Christianity is all about. All of us should be leaders in one way or the other, because leaders are people who have influence over all of us and over other people. And we should all have influence on other people. We should all be directing people to Christ and how he lived this on this earth. This is a responsibility of everyone because we all have circles of influence. And the question is, how are we using those circles of influence? When you see times that you can do good, will you do it? When you see times that you can grow and you can push others to grow in love, indeed, and example, will you do it? When you have opportunity to stand up for what is right and what is true, will you do it? We need people who live lives of righteousness and moral integrity, and deed, and example, and love, and compassion, who are not swayed by the world's increasing sense of moral relativism, but will stand in the gap and rebuild the walls of righteousness. When the need arose in 580 BC, that the Persians were marching on the Grecian homeland, certain men took up their own lives and gave their own lives to give the chance for their home to escape and to fight on. It took men who had leadership quality, who knew who they were and knew where they were going and not afraid to influence others to help save their family and their friends. Will you do the same? Because this life is not all about, this life isn't what everything is about. And if that's the way you live on this earth, then you won't have influence on anyone else. If you look like everyone else, you won't have influence on everyone else. You're a follower and you're not a leader. And God's people needs to be leaders in our world. That's how we'll change society. I really believe it. That's how it worked in the first century, and that could certainly work today. But we need leaders. We need men and women who will want to step up and want to put in the hard work to be mature, devoted Christians who will step up and be the kind of people they could be to lead God's people and the whole world towards him so that we can all be in heaven one day and we can glorify him. Because that's where we're going. And we need people to step up and lead us there. Will you be a leader? Will you grow the future leaders? I hope you will. If we can do anything for you today, if we can help you at all, any spiritual matter whatsoever, if you have sin in your life that you need to get out, we'd love to help you. If you need to be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, we offer that invitation right now as we stand, as we sing.